In the glittering, treacherous world of the British royal family, we know the story of the wife Diana and the mistress, Camilla. But for years, a third woman stood at the heart of Prince Charles's affections, a vibrant, ambitious Australian who became his confidant, his soulmate, and, as many believe, his lover. He even gave her a playful, intimate nickname, Kanga. For a time, she was closer to the future king than anyone. Then one night in 1996, she fell from a third-story window of a rehab clinic, an accident that left her paralyzed. She insisted she was pushed, that someone was trying to silence her. A year later, just 3 months after Diana's own tragic death, Dale Kanga Tryon was dead at 49. Her death was officially ruled to be from natural causes, but to those who knew her story, it felt terrifyingly convenient. This isn't just the story of a forgotten royal affair. It's a dark and tragic mystery about a woman who flew too close to the sun, a woman who knew the secrets of a future king, and who paid the ultimate price when the fairy tale turned into a nightmare. To understand the formidable woman Dale Tryon would become, you have to travel back to her beginning in the sun-drenched suburbs of Melbourne, Australia. Born on January 3, 1948, Dale Harper entered a world of comfortable upper-middle-class privilege. Her father, Barry Harper, was a wealthy printing magnate, a self-made man who could provide his eldest daughter with a fine education, a beautiful home, and a life of apparent ease. Post-war Australia was a society still deeply connected to Britain, the mother country, a place where English traditions were revered, and the royal family was spoken of with an almost religious awe. For an ambitious young girl, London was the ultimate prize, the true center of the universe. From the outside, the Harper family portrait was one of perfect, sun-kissed prosperity. But from a very early age, Dale's life was defined not by privilege, but by a silent, relentless, and isolating pain. As a toddler, she was diagnosed with Perthes disease, a rare and cruel childhood condition where the blood supply to the hip bone is inexplicably cut off. For a developing child, the result is catastrophic. The bone, starved of blood, begins to soften, fracture, and die. For a little girl who should have been running freely under the bright Australian sun, it was a sentence of confinement and agony. Her early years were a blur of sterile white rooms and the antiseptic smell of hospitals. She spent long, lonely stretches in a pediatric ward, separated from her family and peers. Worse still, to prevent the damaged bone from collapsing completely, her legs were encased in heavy iron calipers. Until the age of 9, she was bound in metal, the cold, unforgiving weight, a constant reminder of her own fragility. Every step was a struggle, every movement a negotiation with pain. At the same time, she was battling another congenital defect she was born with, spina bifida, a condition affecting the spine that, though a mild form, guaranteed her a lifetime of chronic back pain and simmering health complications. This childhood of suffering did more than just damage her body. It forged her character with the intensity of a blacksmith's fire. Faced with physical limitations and the profound psychological isolation of being the sick child, the girl who couldn't keep up, Dale made a conscious and brilliant decision. If she could not compete physically, she would dominate socially. She developed a ferocious and dazzling personality as a coping mechanism. She cultivated a radiant joie de vivre, a relentless, almost aggressive joy for living. She became the funniest girl in the room, the one with the quickest wit, the most infectious laugh, and the most boundless, captivating energy. It was a mask, a brilliant and beautiful suit of armor she built to hide the physical and emotional fragility she rarely allowed the world to see. It was a performance, and she became a master performer, learning early that charm and charisma were potent weapons that could distract from any perceived weakness. She learned to conceal her pain with an iron will, a habit that would serve her well for a time in the stiff upper lip world of the British aristocracy she was so desperate to join. This ability to perform wellness, to radiate vitality while privately enduring agony, was the superpower she had cultivated since childhood. It was a formidable and ultimately exhausting skill. That ambition to escape the confines of Melbourne and the shadow of her own medical history became the driving force of her young life. London was not just a city on a map, it was a concept, an idea of a life where she could redefine herself completely, where no one knew the girl in the iron braces, only the dazzling woman she had decided to become. After finishing school, she took a job in public relations with Australia's national airline Qantas. It was the perfect choice for a woman on a mission. The role allowed her to hone her already considerable social skills, network with international figures, and project an image of effortless glamour. It was her ticket out. In 1972, she was transferred to their London office and arrived in England, a vibrant, ambitious 24-year-old ready to conquer a new world. She arrived with a couple of suitcases and an arsenal of charm, wit, and a foreigner's secret weapon. As an Australian, she was an exotic novelty, unbound by the rigid class distinctions that paralyzed the English themselves. She could talk to anyone, charm anyone, because she didn't know the intricate rules she was supposedly meant to be following. London in the early 1970s was a city in transition. The psychedelic haze of the swinging 60s, with its class-breaking pop culture, had given way to a grittier, more complex decade. It was a time of social mobility, yet the ancient, unwritten rules of the British class system still held immense power. At the apex of this system was the aristocracy, a closed and guarded world of titles, country estates, and impenetrable social codes. This was the era of the Sloane Ranger, the social tribe that orbited the young royals. They had a uniform, pearls, headscarves, barber jackets, and a set of shared values that were utterly baffling to outsiders. This world operated on a currency far more valuable than money: bloodlines. It didn't matter how wealthy you were. If you didn't have the right name, the right accent, the right school, and an instinctive knowledge of which fork to use, you were invisible. To enter this world as an outsider, a colonial from Australia, was considered almost impossible. But Dale Harper was no ordinary outsider. She possessed a laser-focused ambition and a complete lack of the deference that was expected of her. She didn't tiptoe around the edges of society. She aimed a cannonball directly at its heart. Just 2 weeks after arriving, she attended a high society dinner party, a calculated move to place herself in the right orbit. It was there she was introduced to a man who held the key to the kingdom, Anthony Tryon, the third Baron Tryon. He was the quintessential English aristocrat, charming, handsome, deeply traditional, and part of a lineage that stretched back centuries. His title wasn't just a name, it represented land, history, and an effortless inherited place at the top of the social pyramid that Dale so intensely craved. Most importantly, he was a close friend and a member of the intimate inner circle of the most eligible bachelor in the world, the Prince of Wales. This was not a circle of acquaintances. It was a tight-knit group of fellow aristocrats who formed a protective fortress around the heir to the throne. They were the men Charles hunted with, fished with, and partied with, the ones who provided him with a semblance of normal life and unwavering loyalty, far from the prying eyes of the public and the stifling protocols of the palace. The connection between the reserved English baron and the vivacious Australian was instant and electric. To understand the speed of their romance, you have to understand the contrast they presented in that staid, formal drawing room. Anthony was utterly captivated by this force of nature, a woman so different from the demure, pedigreed English roses he was used to. She was funny, direct, a little bit loud, and completely unburdened by centuries of stiff upper lip tradition. She was a jolt of pure energy. For Dale, the attraction was a potent cocktail of genuine charm and cold, hard strategy. Anthony was not just a handsome man, he was the perfect target, the embodiment of everything she had crossed the world to find. He was more than a man. He was a destiny. He was the gateway to the world she had dreamed of, the life she believed she was meant to live. Their romance was a whirlwind. For Dale, there was no time to waste. She pursued the relationship with the same relentless drive that had defined her entire life. In 1973, less than a year after she had arrived in London, they were married. The wedding itself was a spectacular statement of her arrival, a masterclass in social conquest. It took place at the Chapel Royal in St. James's Palace, a prestigious and historic venue within a working royal palace. This was not a church one could simply book. Marrying there was a rare privilege, a personal gift granted only with the permission of the Queen herself. The gesture was a clear signal of the groom's standing, his family's long service to the crown, and by extension the bride's astonishing new status. It was the ultimate stamp of approval from the very top. The guest list was a roll call of British high society, led by the Prince of Wales, who served as a prominent and delighted guest. The press photographers gathered outside captured the moment of Dale's ultimate triumph. Dale Harper, the girl from Melbourne with the iron braces, the ambitious PR girl from Qantas, was now Lady Tryon, a baroness, with a magnificent country estate and a direct line to the heart of the monarchy. She had not just entered the closed, guarded world of the aristocracy. In less than a year, she had conquered it, placing herself astonishingly right at its very center. It was a breathtaking social coup, but as she stood there, a newly minted baroness basking in the glow of her success, she was likely unaware that the most important relationship she had secured that day was not with her new husband, but with the best man by his side. She and Anthony settled into a life of aristocratic duty, splitting their time between two very different worlds that required two different performances. Their fashionable home in London was the stage for her social ambition, a theater of influence where deals were done and reputations were made over cocktails and canapes. But the grand family seat, the magnificent Great Durnford Manor in Salisbury, was the backdrop for the traditional aristocratic life. It was a world of muddy Land Rovers, weekend shooting parties, and long fishing expeditions on the River Avon, the world her husband was born into, and the world Prince Charles he used as his ultimate escape. Dale, the consummate performer, learned to master both. In London, she was the glamorous modern socialite. In the country, she could slip into tweed and Wellington boots, proving she could hold her own amongst the landed gentry. Dale took to her new role with characteristic energy and flair. She quickly understood that in her new world, a woman's power was often wielded in the drawing room. She became a celebrated society hostess, her parties legendary for their glamour, their meticulously curated guest lists, and their ability to attract the one guest everyone wanted to see, Prince Charles. Her gatherings were different from the stuffy, formal affairs typical of the aristocracy. She brought a blast of Australian informality and a genuine sense of fun to her events. The guest lists were a clever mix of old money aristocrats, rising political figures, and interesting artists, creating a vibrant, energetic atmosphere that stood in stark contrast to the often dull obligations of the society calendar. To receive an invitation from Lady Tryon was to be guaranteed a night of real laughter and stimulating conversation. And above all, it carried the tantalizing possibility of rubbing shoulders with the heir to the throne, who felt more relaxed and at ease in her company than almost anywhere else. Amidst this whirlwind of social climbing, she also fulfilled her primary dynastic duty. She gave birth to 4 children in quick succession: a daughter, Zoe, in 1974, a son and heir, Charles, in 1976, and twins, Edward and Victoria, in 1979, in a move that signaled the depth of her astonishing new royal connection. Prince Charles was named godfather to her eldest son, a profound honor that cemented her place within the royal fold. This was more than a friendly gesture. It was a public declaration. In the coded world of the British aristocracy, having the Prince of Wales as a godparent to your heir was a masterstroke. It sent an unambiguous message to the entire establishment, and especially to her rivals, that Dale Tryon was not some fleeting fancy or a colonial outsider. She was untouchable, her position personally endorsed and protected by the future king himself. It was a shield and a status symbol of the highest order, a bond that tied her family directly to the crown and ensured her permanent place at the very center of power. But beneath the perfect surface of hunt balls, charity galas, and weekends at the manor, the marriage was a complex and fragile arrangement. It was a bridge for Dale into the world she craved, but that bridge was built on a silent, unspoken, and deeply cynical understanding. This was the unwritten contract of the high aristocracy, a world that prized the preservation of the institution and the monarchy at its heart above all else. Personal happiness was a secondary concern. The maintenance of the facade was everything. It became immediately apparent to those in their circle that the bond between the new Lady Tryon and the Prince of Wales was one of unusual and intense intimacy. It went far beyond the easy friendship Charles shared with the wives of his other friends. There was a spark and electricity, a level of emotional connection that was impossible to hide. They shared private jokes that would leave others in the room feeling like outsiders. Long, confidential phone calls became a daily ritual. And most telling were the fishing trips, where the two would spend hours alone on a quiet riverbank, lost in conversation, a world away from the rigid formalities of court life. It was during these moments that Charles came to rely on her counsel and her uncomplicated, vivacious company. He felt, he told friends, that she was the only person who truly understood the pressures of his role. Friends and insiders have long maintained that Anthony, Lord Tryon, was fully aware of the powerful connection that formed between his new wife and his best friend. He chose to tolerate it. To the modern eye, his position seems almost incomprehensible. But Anthony was a man of his time and his class. He was adhering to an old, unwritten aristocratic code where turning a blind eye to a spouse's indiscretions, especially when they involved the heir to the throne, was preferable to a public scandal that could tarnish the family name and, more importantly, embarrass the monarchy. A messy divorce would have been a disaster, forcing the prince to choose sides and bringing unwanted scrutiny upon their entire circle. So, a pact of silence was forged. Anthony retained his title, his wife, and his proximity to power. Dale got her access to the prince, and Charles got the emotional support of a woman who adored him. It was a perfectly dysfunctional, perfectly aristocratic arrangement. This silent tolerance, however, came at a great private cost. It was a poison that seeped into the foundations of their home. The couple's daughter, Victoria, would later recall vicious, screaming arguments between her parents that echoed through the grand house, fights that were almost always about her mother's relationship with Charles. The fairy tale marriage was, in reality, a deeply troubled and emotionally complex partnership, a quiet tragedy unfolding behind the stately manor walls. While Anthony may have accepted the existence of the relationship, he likely grew to resent the flagrancy with which Dale flaunted it. Her ambition, her successful business named with the prince's own pet name, her constant presence at his side, it all pushed the boundaries of their silent agreement, turning a private secret into a public performance. The arguments were likely not about the affair itself, but about her refusal to be discreet, her ambition to be more than just a quiet mistress. The children were raised in this atmosphere of immense wealth but profound emotional instability. They grew up in a home where the most important subject was the one that could never be discussed, where a powerful, invisible third person was a constant presence in their parents' marriage. They would have seen the strained smiles, felt the tension across the dinner table, and heard the raised voices behind closed doors. They would bear the scars of their parents' secrets, a painful legacy of confusion and insecurity that would become all too clear in the devastating years to come. For a time, however, Dale had successfully achieved her grandest social ambitions. She was a baroness, a mother, a celebrated hostess, and now the closest female friend to the future king. She had mastered the game, or so she thought. But this proximity to the throne, the very thing she had fought so hard to achieve, was a double-edged sword. It had given her a life beyond her wildest dreams, granting her access, influence, and a platform for her own considerable talents. But the other edge of the sword was a constant, invisible threat. Her entire position, her power, and her sense of self-worth had become entirely dependent on the favor of one man. She had no independent power base within the aristocracy. She was not one of them by birth. Her status was conditional, granted by the prince and tolerated by her husband. She was playing a dangerous game whose rules were written by others, rules that prioritized the stability of the monarchy above all else. And in that game, any player who becomes an inconvenience, no matter how beloved, is ultimately expendable. She was flying high, but she was flying too close to the sun, and the fall, when it came, would be brutal and absolute. Having reached the pinnacle of society, Dale was not content to simply be a decorative baroness. Her ambition, forged in a childhood of fighting against her own body, demanded more. She saw her unprecedented access to the Prince of Wales not just as a social triumph, but as a unique business opportunity. In a move that would both define her success and seal her fate, she decided to turn her lover's intimate nickname for her into a commercial brand, a decision that would catapult her to global fame and set her on a collision course with the unwritten rules of the monarchy. In 1983, she opened a boutique in the heart of London's chic Knightsbridge district. She called her brand Kanga, the nickname Prince Charles had affectionately given her, a nod to her Australian roots. The name itself was a stroke of marketing genius. It was intimate, playful, and carried an unmistakable, though unspoken, royal endorsement. Kanga specialized in elegant, brightly colored dresses that were perfect for the social set known as Sloane Rangers, the fashionable upper-class young women who moved in the same circles as the newly married Princess of Wales, Diana. The business was an immediate and spectacular success, but the moment that catapulted Kanga from a society favorite to a global brand came in 1985. At the legendary Live Aid concert, a global event watched by billions, the most famous woman in the world, Diana, Princess of Wales, appeared in a stunning, colorful Kanga dress. The publicity was priceless. The photograph of Diana in that dress was printed in newspapers and magazines around the world. It was a complex and layered moment. The wife of Prince Charles wearing a dress designed by her husband's other great female confidant. The Diana endorsement turned Kanga into a fashion empire. Stores opened across the world from America and Australia to Hong Kong and Spain. Dale was no longer just a society hostess. She was a hugely successful international businesswoman, but her success was dogged by whispers. Critics accused her of shamelessly commercializing her royal connections, of using her friendship with Charles as her primary marketing tool. While she was undoubtedly a talented designer, the question always lingered: were customers buying the dresses, or were they buying a piece of the royal magic? For Dale, her career and her relationship with the prince were inextricably linked, a fusion of ambition and affection that would bring her immense success but would also contribute to her eventual downfall. The true nature of the relationship between Dale Tryon and Prince Charles remains one of the great unspoken secrets of the modern monarchy. While the world was focused on the long-running affair between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, another equally intense relationship was unfolding in parallel. Some sources claim they first met in 1966 when Charles was a teenage schoolboy attending a term at Geelong Grammar in Australia. Most, however, agree that their bond was solidified in the 1970s, after her marriage to his close friend. They were drawn together by a shared sense of humor and a love for country pursuits, particularly fishing. On the quiet riverbanks of the Scottish Highlands, away from the prying eyes of the court, they formed a deep and intimate connection. Charles, a man who often felt isolated and misunderstood within his own family, found in Dale a sympathetic and understanding soul. He famously told a friend that Dale was the only woman who ever really understood me. This was far more than a casual friendship. Royal biographers like Tina Brown and Penny Junor have described a passionate, complex affair that ran for years. Charles, they argue, was equally infatuated with both Dale and Camilla, creating a tense and bitter rivalry between the two women. They were competitors for the affection and attention of the future king. While Camilla was the earthy, horsey country woman, Dale was the glamorous, sophisticated socialite. They were, according to one insider, daggers drawn. Dale understood the power of her position. She was not content to be a secret, hidden away in the countryside. She used her proximity to Charles to build her social standing and her business empire. But it was a dangerous game. She was playing for the highest stakes imaginable, and she had a formidable rival. Ultimately, Charles would make a choice, and it was not her. In the years leading up to his marriage to Diana, and especially in the years after its breakdown, it was Camilla he turned to. The final brutal rejection came in 1997, after years of being slowly frozen out. At a polo match, a traditional playground of the aristocracy, Dale, by then in a fragile state, reportedly pursued Charles, trying to reignite their old intimacy. He publicly and coldly snubbed her, making it clear to everyone watching that she was no longer part of his life. For Dale, this public humiliation was a devastating blow, a signal that she, like so many before her, had been used and then discarded by the very institution she had dedicated her life to. The emotional fallout was catastrophic, and it sent her into a final terrifying spiral. The 1990s were a decade of relentless decline for Dale. The rejection by Charles was the emotional catalyst for a devastating physical and mental breakdown. Her old health problems returned with a vengeance. The Perthes disease and spina bifida, which had been managed for years, now caused her constant, excruciating pain. In 1993, she was diagnosed with uterine cancer. After undergoing grueling treatment, she fell into a deep dependence on the painkillers prescribed to manage her agony. This addiction soon spiraled to include alcohol, primarily vodka and champagne. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. The vibrant, life-loving woman was replaced by a figure who was fragile, paranoid, and consumed by her addictions. In 1996, her family, desperate to help her, checked her into Farm Place, an exclusive addiction treatment center in Surrey. It was here, in May of that year, that the central mystery of her life occurred. One evening, Dale fell from a window in her third-floor room, plummeting 25 feet to the ground below. She survived, but her injuries were horrific. She suffered a fractured skull and a shattered spine, injuries that would leave her paralyzed from the waist down. For the last 18 months of her life, she would be confined to a wheelchair. The official story was that it was a tragic accident or a suicide attempt by a deeply depressed woman. But Dale, from her hospital bed, told a different, far more sinister story. She insisted to anyone who would listen that she had been pushed. "Someone is trying to kill me," she told friends and family. Her claims were dismissed by the authorities and her husband as the paranoid delusions of a mentally unstable addict. But her friends were not so sure. They knew she had been living in a state of genuine fear, convinced she was being watched. The timing was deeply suspicious. Her fall came just as the scandal of Charles and Camilla's affair was becoming public knowledge. Was it possible that someone saw Dale, the other mistress, the one who knew just as much as Camilla, as a dangerous loose end, a potential embarrassment who needed to be silenced? The fall was the final blow to her already shattered life. In 1997, while she was still struggling to adapt to her paralysis, her husband Anthony filed for divorce, citing her unreasonable behavior. Shortly after, following an incident at a local pub, she was sectioned under the Mental Health Act and forcibly hospitalized for 28 days. It was the ultimate humiliation, a move she saw as a final attempt by the establishment to discredit her and shut her up. Cast out by her husband and abandoned by her royal friend, she moved into a suite at the Ritz Hotel in London, a lonely, paralyzed figure, planning a 50th birthday party she would never live to see. After a trip to India for alternative treatment, a trip ironically suggested by Prince Charles, her health collapsed completely. She was admitted to the King Edward VII Hospital in London, suffering from infected pressure sores, a common and dangerous complication of paralysis. On November 15, 1997, Dale, Baroness Tryon, died of septicemia. She was 49 years old. Her death came just 3 months after the death of Princess Diana. To the royal family, and to Prince Charles in particular, her passing was described as a convenient end to a potentially scandalous chapter, removing another one of the women who could have caused him trouble as he began to build a new life with Camilla. Before her death, Dale had reportedly told police that her life was in danger, a warning that was tragically ignored. But a story as complex and controversial as Dale's could not be so easily erased. Her death on a cold London day in November 1997 was not an ending, but the beginning of a persistent and troubling mystery. The official narrative was simple, but for those who knew the full story, her passing, coming so soon after Diana's, felt too neat, too convenient. To understand the legacy she left behind, one must return to the central, terrifying question of her final year. Was she a tragic victim of her own demons or of something far more sinister? To this day, the central question of Dale's final years remains unanswered. The debate comes down to that terrifying moment in May 1996, when she fell from a third-story window at the Farm Place Clinic. There are two completely different stories about what happened, and the truth is likely lost somewhere in the middle. The official story, supported by her husband and the establishment, is a simple, tragic tale of a mental breakdown. In this version, Dale was a woman broken by a lifetime of pain. Her chronic illnesses had become unbearable, she had survived cancer, and she had been publicly rejected by the man she loved. Overwhelmed by it all, she became addicted to painkillers and alcohol. According to this narrative, her claims of being pushed were simply the paranoid delusions of a brilliant mind destroyed by her addictions. The fall was either a suicide attempt or a horrifying drug-fueled accident. It's a plausible and deeply sad explanation, but there is another story, Dale's own. In the months before the fall, her fear was very specific. She told close friends she was being followed and believed her phones were tapped. She was convinced that powerful people saw her as a threat. Even after the fall, from her wheelchair, her story never changes. She told her son Charles, "I didn't jump, I was pushed." This was not a fleeting delusion. It was her steadfast testimony until the day she died. Her fear seems less delusional when you consider the timing. In 1996 and 1997, the monarchy was in its deepest crisis. The divorce of Charles and Diana had damaged its reputation, and an unstable former mistress who knew 2 decades of secrets was a dangerous liability. A tell-all book from the other mistress would have been a catastrophe. Did someone decide she was a risk that could no longer be afforded? We will never know for sure, but the question hangs over her memory like a London fog. The tragedy leaves a difficult legacy for her 4 children. They lost their mother and were left with a complex and painful story, forced to balance loyalty to their aristocratic father with the memory of a mother who was ultimately an outcast from his world. Her eldest daughter, Zoe, even had to become her caregiver in her final agonizing months. In the end, Dale's place in royal history is a cautionary one. Her story stands in stark contrast to that of Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla played the long, patient, and silent game and was eventually rewarded with the crown. Dale refused to play that game. She was the modern, ambitious woman who put her royal connection front and center. By drawing so much attention to the affair, she broke the cardinal rule of discretion and was cast aside. For years, Dale was effectively erased from the story. The public knew the simple triangle: Charles, the wife Diana, and the mistress Camilla. A third woman made the narrative so messy, so she was largely forgotten. Ultimately, the story of Dale Kanga Tryon is one of profound and heartbreaking tragedy. It is the story of a woman who spent a lifetime fighting against the pain of her own body and for a place in a world that was never truly hers. But in the end, the forces against her proved too much to overcome. While Diana is remembered as a tragic saint and Camilla has become a queen, Dale Tryon remains a ghost, a haunting, unanswered question mark in the saga of the House of Windsor. She is the ultimate symbol of the price of royal favor, a vibrant life that was cherished, used, discarded, and finally extinguished, leaving behind only the unsettling whisper of a secret that will likely never be told.